When a police dog follows a silent little girl into a basement, no one expects the horror that awaits below. Officer James Miller thought it was just another routine welfare check, until his canine partner Rex refused to leave the child's side. What began as instinct quickly turned into terror as the basement revealed secrets that no one was meant to find. The discovery was so disturbing that even this battle-hardened officer had to step back, his hand trembling on his service weapon. And this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change everything. Officer James Miller had seen it all in his 15 years on the force, or so he thought. The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon, nothing special about it. Just a neighbor reporting strange noises from the house next door. The kind of call that usually ended with an apology for wasting police time. Miller had been ready to clock out, his shift nearly over. But something in the dispatcher's voice made him take the call anyway. Dispatch to Unit 14. We've got a welfare check at 1478 Oakwood Drive. Neighbor reports unusual activity and crying sounds. Copy that. Unit 14 responding, Miller replied, turning to his canine partner. What do you think, Rex? Another false alarm? He scratched behind the German Shepherd's ears as they pulled up to the suburban home. Perfect lawn, fresh paint, flower beds meticulously maintained. American dream material from the outside. The neighborhood was upscale, the kind where people minded their own business and problems stayed behind closed doors. As Miller stepped out of his cruiser, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway. Something in the air felt different, heavy with tension. But something was definitely off. Rex's ears perked forward, his body suddenly rigid with alertness. In all their years together, Miller had never seen his partner react this way to a routine call. The dog's hackles rose slightly, a low rumble building in his chest. Easy, boy, he whispered, resting a reassuring hand on Rex's head. But the dog's growl only deepened as they approached the front door. Miller noticed the curtains twitch before he even rang the doorbell. Someone had been watching them arrive. When the door finally opened, a smiling couple greeted them. Too quickly, too eagerly. Their clothes were impeccable, their smiles practiced, but their eyes never quite meeting his. The woman's hands fidgeted with her wedding ring, twisting it nervously around her finger. Everything's fine here, officer. Just a misunderstanding with the neighbors, the man said, his voice steady but his hand gripping the doorframe with white knuckles. We were just watching a movie. The volume might have been too high. Miller nodded slowly, years of experience telling him something wasn't adding up. The house was too quiet for people who had supposedly just been watching a loud movie. And Rex was still on high alert, his focus unwavering. Mind if I come in and take a look around? Just procedure, Miller said, already stepping forward slightly. The couple exchanged a glance so quick, most would have missed it. Of course, officer. We have nothing to hide, the woman replied, her smile never reaching her eyes. As they stepped into the immaculate living room, Miller scanned for anything out of place. Everything looked normal, almost too normal, like a showroom rather than a lived-in home. But Rex's gaze was fixed beyond them, into the shadows of the hallway where a small figure stood, watching silently. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, with hollow eyes that seemed to hold secrets no child should know. But what Officer Miller didn't know was that behind this perfect family facade lurked a secret so dark it would haunt him for years to come. The little girl didn't speak. Not a word. She just stood there in her pristine white dress, unblinking, as Miller introduced himself. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, not a strand out of place. Too perfect, Miller thought. Like a doll arranged for display rather than a child who had been playing or living normally. Rex whined softly and moved toward her, breaking protocol in a way Miller had never seen before. The highly trained K9 was supposed to stay at his side unless commanded otherwise. "This is my daughter Lily," the woman said quickly, stepping between Miller and the child. Her manicured nails dug into the fabric of her own sleeve. "She's shy around strangers. Doesn't talk much, even to us sometimes." The laugh that followed was brittle, like glass about to shatter. Miller nodded, crouching down to the girl's eye level, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. 15 years on the force had taught him how to approach traumatized children. "Hi there, Lily. This is my friend Rex. He's a police dog, but he's very friendly. He helps me keep people safe." Lily's eyes flickered briefly, not to Miller, but to Rex. Something passed between child and animal, a silent communication that made the hair on Miller's neck stand up. The dog's ears twitched forward and his posture changed subtly. Miller had worked with Rex for 7 years, and he knew all the animal's tells. Right now, Rex was sensing something wrong, very wrong. "Everything looks fine here," the man, who had introduced himself as David Thompson, said with forced cheerfulness, clapping his hands together once. "We appreciate your concern, but as you can see, there's nothing wrong. Just a normal Tuesday evening for the Thompsons." He gestured around the immaculate living room with its untouched magazines fanned perfectly on the coffee table. Miller should have left then. By all accounts, there was nothing visibly amiss. No signs of distress, no evidence of wrongdoing. Just an ordinary family in an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood where people minded their business and kept their lawns trimmed. His sergeant would tell him to stop wasting department time on paranoia and hunches. The paperwork for an unauthorized search would be a nightmare. But Rex wouldn't move. The dog sat firmly beside Lily, his eyes trained on her face, his body angled slightly between her and her parents. In all their years of service together, Miller had never seen his partner behave this way. Protective, almost possessive of a stranger. "Rex, come," Miller commanded, his voice firm. The dog's ears twitched in acknowledgement, but he didn't budge. Miller felt the first real stirring of alarm. Rex was impeccably trained. He never disobeyed a direct command. Then, so subtly Miller almost missed it, Lily's small hand moved to rest on Rex's back. Her fingers curled into his fur, and she turned her gaze toward a door at the end of the hallway. Her eyes lingered there for 3 long seconds before returning to the floor. It was the most deliberate movement she'd made since they arrived. "What's down there?" Miller asked casually, nodding toward the door, keeping his tone conversational even as his instincts screamed that something was very, very wrong in this house. "Just the basement," David answered too quickly, stepping slightly to block Miller's view of the hallway. A bead of sweat had formed at his temple despite the cool air conditioning. "Storage, laundry room. Nothing interesting. Old Christmas decorations, that sort of thing. Actually, it's a bit of a mess down there. We've been meaning to organize it. Lily, honey, why don't you go to your room while the officer finishes up?" Mrs. Thompson's voice had an edge to it now, her perfect smile slipping at the corners. She reached for her daughter, fingers grasping air as Lily shifted almost imperceptibly away from her touch. "You have homework to finish before dinner." But Lily was already moving, her hand still buried in Rex's fur, leading the dog toward the basement door with slow, deliberate steps. Her white socks made no sound on the hardwood floor, but each step seemed to echo in Miller's mind like a warning bell. Rex followed without hesitation, leaving Miller no choice but to follow. The bond between handler and K9 was sacred. Where Rex went, he went. "There's really no need," David started, moving to intercept them. His voice had risen half an octave, and the friendly mask was slipping to reveal something harder beneath. His wife had gone completely pale, one hand clutching at her necklace so tightly the chain was cutting into her skin. "It'll just take a minute," Miller replied, his voice steady even as his pulse quickened. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster, not drawing, just ready. "Standard procedure. We need to check all levels of the residence." It wasn't strictly true, but they didn't need to know that. The basement door creaked open under Lily's small hand, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying with it a smell that Miller's brain couldn't immediately identify. But that made his stomach clench with instinctive dread. Musty and metallic, with an underlying sweetness that reminded him of crime scenes he'd rather forget. As Lily took the first step down, Rex beside her, Miller reached for the light switch mounted on the wall. The Thompsons stood frozen in the hallway, their perfect facade crumbling with each passing second. David's hands had curled into fists at his sides, and his wife was silently mouthing what looked like a prayer. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the staircase with harsh, unforgiving clarity. The wooden steps were old but clean, unlike what one would expect from a messy storage area. Too clean, in fact, recently scrubbed. Miller noticed dark stains in the grain of the wood that might have been anything, paint, wine, something worse, but had been meticulously attempted to be removed. And that's when Miller heard it. A sound from below that would change everything. A sound that no officer ever wants to hear, that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The muffled cry of another child, followed by the faint but unmistakable clink of metal against metal, like a chain being pulled taut. Miller's hand moved from his holster to his radio in one fluid motion, his eyes never leaving the Thompsons as he backed toward the staircase. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I'm going to need backup at 1478 Oakwood Drive. Possible 207 in progress. Repeat, possible kidnapping situation." The world seemed to slow down as David Thompson lunged forward with a guttural cry, revealing what he'd been reaching for behind his back, a glint of steel that Miller recognized immediately as a threat. This routine call had just become anything but routine. Miller's training kicked in instantly. 15 years on the force had hardened his reflexes to diamond precision. As David Thompson lunged forward, Miller sidestepped, drawing his service weapon in one fluid motion. The weight of the Glock was familiar in his hands, an extension of himself after thousands of hours of training and field work. His finger moved to rest alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, ready but disciplined. "Police, drop the weapon," he commanded, his voice echoing through the pristine hallway. The family photos on the walls seemed to watch the scene unfold. Smiling faces of the Thompsons at beaches, birthday parties, and holiday gatherings. A perfect family narrative, carefully constructed and framed under glass. Thompson froze, the kitchen knife clutched in his white-knuckled grip. It was an expensive chef's knife, Miller noted absently. The kind you'd see in a cooking show, with a polished wooden handle and a gleaming blade that caught the light. His eyes darted between Miller's gun and the basement door, calculating odds that were rapidly diminishing. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, disappearing into the collar of his pressed button-down shirt. Mrs. Thompson began to sob, her perfect makeup running in dark, rivulets down her cheeks, mascara tracing paths like black tears on porcelain. "You don't understand," Thompson hissed, his friendly neighbor persona completely evaporated. His voice had dropped an octave, taking on a quality that raised the hair on Miller's arms. "You have no idea what you're getting into. This is bigger than you know." The hand not holding the knife twitched toward his pocket before stopping. Another weapon? A phone? Miller couldn't risk finding out. From the basement came another cry, louder this time. Not just a whimper, but a distinct word. "Help!" The voice was young, frightened, hoarse as if from disuse. Rex's barking joined the chaos, the dog having descended further into the darkness with Lily. The German shepherd's barks weren't his standard alert barks, but something more urgent, almost frantic. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground. Now." Miller kept his aim steady, years of range practice guiding his hands, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He could feel his heartbeat, controlled but rapid, the blood rushing in his ears like distant surf. Backup is already on the way. "This ends now, Thompson." For a moment, Miller thought Thompson might charge anyway. There was a wild, cornered animal look in his eyes, the desperate calculation of a man with nothing to lose. A muscle jumped in his jaw, and his knuckles whitened further around the knife handle. But then something shifted in his expression. Resignation, perhaps, or a new calculation. The knife clattered to the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence, and Thompson sank to his knees. His shoulders slumped, but his eyes remained alert, watchful. "Cuff yourself," Miller ordered, keeping his weapon trained on Thompson with one hand while retrieving a pair of zip ties from his belt with the other. He tossed them toward the man. "Loop them through the stair railing first, then around your wrists. Tight, where I can see them." He glanced briefly at Mrs. Thompson, who had backed against the wall, her hands covering her face. "You too, ma'am. Now." "Please," she whispered through her fingers, her wedding ring catching the light as her hands trembled. "You don't know what they'll do when they find out. They'll come for all of us." "Who will come?" Miller asked. But she just shook her head, tears flowing freely as she complied with his orders, securing herself to the ornate banister of the main staircase. With the Thompsons temporarily secured, Miller holstered his weapon but kept his hand near it as he approached the basement door. He paused at the threshold, listening. Rex's barking had subsided to a low growl, punctuated by what sounded like scratching against metal. The cries had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Miller descended the basement stairs, each step creaking under his weight despite his attempt at stealth. The stairwell was narrow, the walls closing in on either side, painted a sterile white that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it. The smell grew stronger with each step, damp and metallic, undercut with something chemical. Bleach, his mind supplied. Someone had been cleaning up. A lot. Recently. The basement was not what he expected from the Thompsons' description of a cluttered storage area. No cobwebs or holiday decorations or forgotten exercise equipment. Instead, it was clinically organized, with bright overhead lights illuminating white-painted walls and polished concrete floors. A large metal desk sat against one wall, 3 computer monitors glowing with what looked like security camera feeds. A series of heavy doors lined the opposite wall, not typical storage closets, but reinforced metal with deadbolts and small viewing windows, like something from a high-security psychiatric facility. Rex stood at the third door, pawing frantically at the metal, leaving scratch marks on the painted surface. The dog's hackles were raised, his powerful body tense with agitation. Lily stood beside him, her small hand resting on the dog's back, her expression unchanged, but her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't acknowledge Miller's presence, didn't turn when he approached, just continued her silent vigil beside the dog. Miller approached cautiously, one hand on his holstered weapon, the other reaching for the small flashlight on his belt. He leaned in, peering through the small window set at adult eye level in the door. What he saw inside made his blood run cold, his trained composure cracking for the first time that evening. A child, a boy no older than 6, huddled in the corner of what looked like a hospital room. The space was maybe 10 by 12 feet, with gleaming white tiles on the floor and walls. He wore clean clothes, a blue t-shirt and gray sweatpants that looked new, but was shackled to the wall by one ankle, a padded cuff connected to a short length of chain that allowed only a few feet of movement. A small cot with a thin mattress was bolted to the floor, its sheets pulled tight with hospital corners. Medical equipment lined the walls, monitors, an IV stand, what looked like a medication dispensing system. A small camera observed from the ceiling corner, its red light blinking steadily. On a small table sat a stack of workbooks and a cup of pencils, neatly arranged. "Jesus Christ," Miller whispered, trying the door handle. Locked, as expected. The mechanism felt heavy, industrial grade. "Hey, buddy," he called through the door, keeping his voice gentle despite the rage and horror building inside him. "I'm a police officer. I'm going to get you out of there, okay? You're safe now." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He moved his lips, but no sound came out, as if he'd forgotten how to speak or was afraid to make noise. His gaze darted to the camera in the corner, then back to Miller. "Are there others?" Miller asked gently, already dreading the answer. He turned to Lily, whose blank expression hadn't changed, though something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a memory. Lily nodded silently, pointing to the other doors. 1, 2, 3, 4 more doors lined the wall. 5 children in total, including the boy Miller could see. Miller's radio crackled at his hip, making him flinch in the tense silence. "Unit 14, backup is 3 minutes out. What's your status?" "Copy that," he responded, his voice steady despite the horror unfolding before him. Years of training helping him compartmentalize, stay functional. "Be advised we have multiple juvenile victims. Request immediate medical support and CPS. Possible human trafficking situation. Suspects are secured, but approach with caution." He paused, then added, "And bring bolt cutters, heavy-duty ones." As sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, Miller turned his attention to the locks. He tried keys from a ring hanging near the desk. None fit. Whatever was happening in this house, this seemingly perfect suburban home with its manicured lawn and friendly neighbors, was beyond anything he'd encountered before. The level of organization, the clinical setup, the security measures. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. This was methodical, planned, long-term. And somewhere above them, Mrs. Thompson had stopped crying. Her voice drifted down the stairwell, eerily calm now, almost sing-song in its cadence. "They were already broken when they came to us," she called, each word precise and measured. "Damaged goods, unwanted, discarded. We were fixing them, making them better. Perfect." A soft laugh followed, devoid of humor or warmth. "Lily was our first, our prototype. Isn't she beautiful now? So obedient, so quiet." Miller felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at Lily's expressionless face, understanding dawning with sickening clarity. The perfect posture, the immaculate appearance, the absolute silence and compliance. She wasn't just a witness. She was their first success. "We're going to get you help," Miller said softly to Lily, crouching to her level. "All of you. I promise." For the first time since he'd entered the house, Lily's expression changed, just slightly, the corners of her mouth twitching as if she'd forgotten how to smile, but was trying to remember. Her small hand reached out, hesitant, and touched his badge. Outside, the wail of sirens grew to a crescendo as the first responding units arrived. Heavy footsteps pounded across the porch above. Radios crackled with official voices. Help had arrived. But as Miller looked at the row of doors, each potentially hiding another child, another victim, he knew this was just the beginning. Whatever darkness they had uncovered in this perfect suburban home went deeper than one basement, one family. Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in his mind. "You don't know what they'll do when they find out." Who were they? And what else would they find behind those locked doors? The real nightmare was just beginning to unfold. The sun broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the suburban neighborhood that had been the backdrop for such darkness just hours earlier. The sound of sirens had faded, replaced by the quiet bustle of morning life. And the bustle of first responders now felt like a distant echo. Miller stood outside the now quiet house, the air thick with the weight of what had transpired. As the medics worked to assess the children, he took a moment to gather his thoughts. The chaos of the night had left him feeling both exhilarated and exhausted. They had saved lives, but the enormity of the situation weighed heavily on him. He had seen the fear in the children's eyes, the way they clung to one another, and he knew that the road to recovery would be long and fraught with challenges. Miller's mind raced with questions. How had the Thompsons managed to keep their operation hidden for so long? What had driven them to such extremes? And most importantly, how many other children might still be out there, lost in the shadows? These thoughts swirled in his mind as he watched the medics work, their movements efficient and calm. "Hey, Miller," Officer Chen called, waving him over. She stood by the ambulance, clipboard in hand, speaking with a medic who was checking on the children. "We've got them stabilized. They're going to be okay. But we need to get statements from them as soon as they're ready." "Right," Miller replied, running a hand through his hair. "I'll coordinate with CPS. They need to be involved immediately." He turned to look back at the house, feeling a sense of urgency. We need to start digging into the Thompsons' background. There has to be something in their history that points to this. "Already on it," Chen assured him, her tone brisk. "I've got a couple of officers heading to the station to pull their records. We'll see if there's anything that stands out, previous complaints, odd behavior, anything we can use to build a case." As the medics gently ushered the children into the ambulance, Miller's heart ached for them. They were so small, and the world they had known was so far removed from the safety and comfort they deserved. He wished he could take away their pain, erase the memories of their ordeal, but he knew that wasn't possible. Healing would take time, and they would need support every step of the way. "Do you think they'll remember what happened?" Chen asked, watching as the ambulance doors closed behind the medics. "I mean, when they're ready to talk?" "It's hard to say," Miller replied, his voice thoughtful. "Trauma can do strange things to memory. Some kids might block it out completely, while others will remember every detail. We need to approach this delicately. They're going to need therapy. Someone who specializes in trauma. The sound of footsteps approached, and Miller turned to see the sergeant. A tall figure with a commanding presence, striding toward them. "Miller, Chen," he greeted them, his expression serious. "What's the status?" 4 children were rescued from the basement, Miller reported, meeting his sergeant's gaze. "We're working with medics and CPS now. The Thompsons are in custody, but we need to figure out the extent of their operation. This isn't just a one-off situation. They had a system in place." The sergeant nodded, his brow furrowing. "Get me everything you can on the Thompsons. I want to know how long this has been going on and if there's a larger network involved. We need to be prepared for any fallout from this." "Understood," Miller replied, already feeling the pressure of the investigation mounting. "I'll coordinate with the detectives, make sure we have everything we need to build a solid case." As the sergeant walked away to confer with other officers, Miller felt a renewed sense of determination. This was more than just a case. It was a mission to protect the vulnerable and ensure justice for those who had suffered. He thought of the children, of their faces filled with fear and uncertainty, and he knew he couldn't let them down. "Let's head back to the station," he said to Chen, who nodded in agreement. "We need to regroup and figure out our next steps." The drive back to the station was filled with a heavy silence, both officers lost in their thoughts. Miller's mind raced with the images of the children he had seen, their small faces etched with fear and confusion. How could anyone do this to innocent kids? He felt a deep sense of anger welling up inside him, a fire that fueled his resolve to see this through to the end. As they arrived at the station, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Officers and detectives were busy at their desks, phones ringing, and the sound of keyboards clicking filled the air. Miller and Chen made their way to the back, where the detectives had already started compiling information on the Thompsons. "Hey, Miller," Detective Harris greeted him, her expression serious. "We've pulled some background checks on the Thompsons. You're not going to like what we found." "Lay it on me," Miller replied, steeling himself for the worst. David Thompson has a clean record, no prior arrests, no complaints, nothing. But his wife Sarah has a history, a couple of minor infractions, but they were all sealed. We're working on getting access to those records now." "What kind of infractions?" Miller asked, leaning forward in his chair, his interest piqued. "Petty theft, mostly," Harris replied, flipping through the pages in front of her. "A few shoplifting charges from years ago, but they were dismissed. It seems like they've kept a low profile since then. Almost too low." "Right," Miller said, running a hand through his hair. "We need to dig deeper. If they've been involved in something larger, we need to find out who else is involved and how far this goes." "Agreed," Chen chimed in. "We should also look into any connections they might have with local shelters or organizations. They could have been taking in children who were already in vulnerable situations." As they continued to brainstorm ideas, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Officers were huddled around computers, poring over databases, searching for any leads that could connect the Thompsons to a larger network. The urgency of the situation pressed down on them like a heavy weight. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. Miller felt the fatigue creeping in, but he pushed it aside. They had to keep going. "Let's gather the team," he said, rising to his feet. "We need to share what we've found and discuss our next steps. This is just the beginning." As they convened, Miller addressed the group, outlining the facts they had gathered about the Thompsons and the children they had rescued. The atmosphere was charged with determination. everyone ready to play their part in uncovering the truth. "We need to be thorough," Miller emphasized. "We can't afford to let anything slip through the cracks. The lives of these children depend on us finding out the truth." The team nodded in agreement, and Miller could see the resolve in their eyes. They were all in this together, united in their mission to uncover the dark reality hidden behind the Thompsons' facade. As the meeting concluded, Miller found a moment to step outside for some fresh air. The cool evening breeze felt refreshing against his skin, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere inside. He looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle in the night sky, feeling a mix of hope and despair. He thought of the children they had rescued, their futures uncertain, but now filled with a glimmer of hope. They had taken the first step toward healing, and he was determined to help them every step of the way. As he returned to the station, a renewed sense of purpose filled him. He would not rest until every last thread of this case was unraveled, and every child was safe. The fight was far from over, but he knew they would face whatever came next together. In the weeks that followed, the investigation would continue to unfold, revealing layers of complexity that none of them could have anticipated. Miller steeled himself for the challenges ahead, knowing that the road would be long and fraught with difficulties, but also filled with the promise of justice for those who had suffered in silence for far too long. This was not just a case, it was a calling, and he would see it through to the end. The detective's bullpen at the precinct was a controlled chaos of activity. Whiteboards covered with photographs, timelines, and connections lined the walls. Miller stood in front of the largest one, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, studying the web of information they had compiled over the past 72 hours. The Thompsons' faces stared back at him from their mugshots, their expressions now devoid of the friendly warmth they had displayed to the neighborhood. "We've got something," Detective Harris announced, approaching Miller with a thick folder. Her eyes were red-rimmed from hours of staring at screens, but there was a spark of excitement in them. Financial records show regular transfers to an offshore account. We're talking about significant amounts of money, thousands of dollars every month for the past 3 years. Miller felt his pulse quicken. 3 years. That means this has been going on longer than we thought. What about the source of the transfers? That's where it gets interesting, Harris continued, opening the folder to reveal a series of bank statements. The money is coming from multiple sources: individuals, small businesses, even some charitable organizations. It's deliberately obfuscated, but the pattern is clear. Someone is paying them for something. "The children," Miller said grimly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "They're being paid to keep the children, but paid by whom?" Chen approached, holding her own stack of papers. "I've been tracking the charitable organizations that transferred money to the Thompsons. One name keeps appearing: the Harmony Foundation. It's supposed to be a non-profit dedicated to helping at-risk youth. But when I dug deeper, I found almost no legitimate activities. No community outreach programs, no shelters, nothing. It's a front." "A front for what?" Miller asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Human trafficking," Chen replied quietly. "We think the Thompsons were part of a larger operation. The children they had in that basement weren't random victims. They were specifically selected and placed there for a reason." The room seemed to grow colder. Miller's mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just a case of a deranged couple. It was part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The scope of the investigation had just expanded exponentially. "We need to find out who runs the Harmony Foundation," Miller said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "And we need to do it fast. If there are other children out there, already working on it, Harris interrupted. I've got a warrant being prepared to access their financial records and communications. We should have it by tomorrow morning. Good, Miller replied. In the meantime, I want to visit the children. We need to see if they can tell us anything about how they ended up with the Thompsons. Even small details could help us. The children had been placed in protective custody at a secure facility under the care of trained social workers and child psychologists. Miller knew that interviewing them would be delicate work. They had already been through so much. But it was necessary. They were the key to understanding the full scope of this operation. As Miller made his way to the facility, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, a sense of dread washing over him. The message was brief but chilling. You should have left it alone, Detective. There are consequences for interfering with things you don't understand. Miller's jaw clenched. Someone was watching them, monitoring their progress. The investigation had just taken a dangerous turn. He arrived at the facility shortly after, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city designed to provide a safe haven for vulnerable children. The staff greeted him warmly, though there was a wariness in their eyes. They had seen the worst that society had to offer, and they were protective of their charges. The children are doing better, the facility director, Dr. Patricia Caldwell, informed him as they walked through the hallways. They're still processing what happened, but with proper care and support, we believe they can make a full recovery. Lily, in particular, has started opening up. She's been drawing pictures and has even begun to speak more freely. That's good to hear, Miller replied, though his mind was still on the threatening message. I'd like to speak with them if they're willing. I need to ask them some questions about how they came to be with the Thompsons. Dr. Caldwell nodded. I'll prepare them, but I want to be present during the interviews. They're still very fragile, and I need to ensure that this doesn't cause them further trauma. They made their way to a comfortable room, decorated with soft colors and filled with toys and books. It was designed to be as non-threatening as possible, a stark contrast to the clinical basement where the children had been held. Jake and Abby were sitting together on a cushioned seat, coloring pictures. They looked up as Miller entered, their expressions wary but less frightened than before. Hey, you two, Miller greeted them gently, kneeling down to their level. How are you feeling today? Okay, Jake replied, his voice still small and uncertain. Are we going home? The question broke Miller's heart. These children had been through unimaginable trauma, and yet they still longed for the comfort of home, wherever that might be. We're working on finding your families, Miller said carefully. But first, I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay? Both children nodded, though Abby reached for Jake's hand, seeking comfort in his presence. Can you tell me how you met the Thompsons? Miller asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting toward Dr. Caldwell before he began to speak. I was at the shelter. The lady, Mrs. Thompson, she came there with other people. They said they wanted to help kids like us. They said we could go to their house and learn things and be part of a family. And how did that make you feel? Miller asked, leaning forward slightly. Happy, Jake admitted. We didn't have anywhere else to go. The shelter was crowded and the people there were mean sometimes. When Mrs. Thompson smiled at us, it felt like she really cared. Miller felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. The Thompsons had been predatory in the most insidious way. They had exploited the children's vulnerability and desperate need for belonging. "Do you remember the names of the other people who came to the shelter with Mrs. Thompson?" Miller pressed gently. Jake thought for a moment, then shook his head. "There was a man, but I don't remember his name. He was nice too. He brought us candy and asked us questions about our families, about whether anyone would miss us." The question itself was a red flag. The traffickers had been carefully selecting children who were unlikely to be reported missing. Children with no family, no one to advocate for them. It was a calculated, methodical approach to their crime. "What about Lily?" Miller asked. "How long has she been with the Thompsons?" "A long time." Abby spoke up for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was already there when we arrived. She didn't talk much, and she did whatever they told her to do. Sometimes she would help Mrs. Thompson with us, making sure we ate and took our medicine." "Medicine?" Miller's stomach churned at the implication. "What kind of medicine?" "Pills," Jake replied. "They said it would help us sleep and keep us calm. But sometimes I didn't want to take them because they made me feel weird." Dr. Caldwell placed a reassuring hand on Miller's shoulder, silently communicating that this line of questioning was pushing the children's limits. Miller nodded, understanding that he needed to wrap up the interview. "You both did a great job answering my questions," Miller said, offering them a warm smile. "You're very brave. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Anything you remember that might be important?" Abby tugged on Miller's sleeve, drawing him closer. "There's a room," she whispered. "Downstairs, past where we were kept. We heard sounds coming from there sometimes. Bad sounds, like people were hurting." Miller's blood ran cold. There were other rooms in the basement, rooms they hadn't discovered. "Thank you for telling me, Abby. That's very important information." As he left the facility, Miller's mind was already formulating a plan. They needed to go back to the Thompson house and conduct a more thorough search. There was clearly more to uncover, more victims potentially still hidden away. Back at the station, he gathered his team and briefed them on what the children had revealed. The discovery of additional rooms in the basement sent a chill through the room. "We need a new warrant," Miller announced. "We need to search that basement completely, and we need to do it today. If there are other victims—" "Already on it," Harris said, holding up her phone. "I've got the DA on the line. They're expediting a warrant for a full ESOF forensic search of the property." As they prepared for the return to the Thompson house, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something much larger and far more sinister. The threatening message he had received earlier weighed on his mind. Someone powerful was watching their investigation, and they were clearly willing to go to great lengths to protect their operation. But Miller was undeterred. He had made a promise to those children, and he intended to keep it. No matter what obstacles lay ahead, no matter how deep this conspiracy ran, he would see it through to the very end. The sun was beginning to set as they prepared to return to Oakwood Drive. Miller took a moment to look at the photographs of the children pinned to the bulletin board, their faces a constant reminder of why this fight mattered. Whatever darkness they uncovered next, he was ready to face it head on. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Thompson residence as Miller and his team pulled up to the curb. The house that had once seemed so inviting, so perfectly manicured with its white picket fence and well-maintained garden, now appeared sinister in the fading light. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the property, fluttering gently in the cool breeze like a warning to all who approached. The neighborhood had grown quiet. residents retreating behind closed doors, unwilling to acknowledge the darkness that had been lurking in their midst all along. Miller stepped out of the vehicle, the new warrant clutched firmly in his hand. This time, they would be thorough. This time, they would uncover every secret hidden within those walls. Behind him, a team of forensic specialists, evidence technicians, and detectives emerged from their vehicles, each carrying specialized equipment and determination etched across their faces. The weight of the investigation hung over them like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. "All right, listen up." Miller addressed the assembled team, his voice carrying the weight of authority and purpose. "We're looking for anything that might indicate additional victims, communication with trafficking networks, financial records, anything that connects the Thompsons to the Harmony Foundation or any other criminal enterprise. We also need to locate and document any additional rooms or spaces in the basement that we haven't yet explored. The children mentioned hearing sounds from areas we haven't accessed. Treat this as a potential active crime scene. If you find anything, no matter how insignificant it might seem, I want it documented and cataloged. We're not just collecting evidence. We're building a case that will stand up in court and bring these criminals to justice." The team nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had been briefed on the way over about the additional rooms, about the possibility of other victims still potentially being held in unknown locations. The energy among them was tense, focused, driven by a shared sense of urgency and moral obligation. Each officer knew that time was of the essence. If there were other children out there, every moment counted. As they entered the house, the smell hit them immediately. A mixture of cleaning products and something else. Something chemical and unpleasant that made Miller's skin crawl. The Thompsons had tried to sanitize the scene, to erase evidence of their crimes, to scrub away the physical manifestations of their evil. But forensics had come a long way in recent years, and Miller knew that even the most thorough cleanup left traces. Microscopic fibers, biological evidence, residue patterns. All of it could tell a story to those trained to listen. The living room was exactly as they had left it. Furniture perfectly arranged in a way that suggested careful planning and deliberate staging. Family photos still hanging on the walls in ornate frames, a testament to the facade the Thompsons had so carefully constructed. But now, knowing what lay beneath that veneer of normalcy, every perfectly placed object felt like a lie, a prop in an elaborate theatrical production designed to deceive. The throw pillows on the sofa, the carefully selected artwork, the decorative objects on the mantelpiece, all of it was part of an elaborate performance, a mask worn by predators. "Start with the upstairs," Miller directed half the team, his voice clear and authoritative. "Look for anything that might indicate the children were here. Clothing, toys, personal items, anything that doesn't fit the narrative they've created. Check the bedrooms, the closets, the attic, even the walls for hidden compartments. Document everything with photographs and measurements. Chain of custody is critical here." The remaining team members followed Miller down to the basement, where the true horror of their operation had been revealed just days earlier. The clinical white walls seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, casting an almost ethereal quality to the space, though the atmosphere felt anything but heavenly. The air felt thick and oppressive, heavy with the weight of suffering and despair. The metal doors that had imprisoned the children were still there, though now they stood open, revealing the sparse rooms beyond, rooms that had served as cages for innocent children. "Over here," Detective Chen called from the far end of the basement, her voice echoing off the concrete walls with an almost haunting quality. "There's another door. It's hidden behind this shelving unit. It looks intentional, deliberately concealed. Miller moved quickly to where she stood, his heart already beginning to race with anticipation and dread. Together, they examined the door carefully. It was painted the same white as the walls, blending seamlessly into the surrounding surface. If not for the shelving unit that had been moved aside, it would have been nearly invisible. A secret within a secret, hidden layers of concealment suggesting a paranoia born from guilt. The lock was different from the others, more sophisticated, more secure, suggesting that whatever lay beyond was considered particularly valuable or dangerous. It was a heavy-duty deadbolt, the kind used in commercial applications, not residential ones. The Thompsons had invested in serious security measures for this particular space. "Get the bolt cutters," Miller ordered, his voice steady despite the anxiety coiling in his gut. "And document the positioning of this door before we open it. I want photographs from multiple angles." As the forensic technician worked to cut through the lock, the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the basement, a harsh, grinding noise that seemed to echo through the space. The tension in the air was almost palpable, each member of the team acutely aware that they were on the verge of uncovering something significant, something that would likely expand the scope of their investigation exponentially. With a final snap, the lock gave way with a metallic clang, and the door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into complete darkness. Miller felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the basement. A sub-basement. The Thompsons had built a hidden level beneath their already hidden operation, a basement within a basement, a space designed to be completely isolated from the outside world. "Get the lights," Miller commanded, his voice steady despite the dread coiling in his stomach like a serpent preparing to strike. "And nobody goes down there until we've documented the entrance thoroughly. I want photographs, measurements, everything." Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating a staircase that was narrow and claustrophobic. The walls painted a dark gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As they descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air became stale and recycled, suggesting some kind of closed environmental system. What they found at the bottom of the stairs was even more disturbing than what they had found above. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, each drawer labeled meticulously with dates and initials. In the center of the room stood a large desk with multiple computer monitors, all dark and dormant, their screens like dead eyes staring into nothingness. Along one wall, shelves held boxes of files, photographs, and what appeared to be video equipment, high-end recording devices, professional-grade cameras, lighting rigs. "My God," Chen whispered, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room in slow, deliberate movements. This is a documentation center. They were recording everything. This wasn't just about holding children, it was about creating content. This was a production facility. The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. The Thompsons weren't just traffickers. They were producers. They were creating material, documentation of their crimes. The implications were staggering and deeply disturbing. Miller's jaw clenched as the full scope of the operation became clear. This wasn't just about housing children. It was about creating a record, a catalog of their crimes. The thought made him feel physically ill, a wave of nausea washing over him as he contemplated the ramifications. "Photograph everything," he instructed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And carefully. We need to preserve the integrity of these files. This is evidence of the highest order. Nobody touches anything without gloves, and I want every single item cataloged and documented. This is going to be critical to building our case." As the team began their meticulous documentation, Miller approached one of the filing cabinets, The drawers were labeled methodically: 2022 Q1, 2022 Q2, 2022 Q3, and so on, extending back several years. The precision of the organization suggested a mind that was methodical, systematic, and deeply disturbed. He carefully opened one drawer, using latex gloves to protect the evidence, revealing dozens of folders, each containing photographs and documents, organized with almost obsessive attention to detail. The images inside made his blood boil with an intensity he had rarely experienced. They were documentation of the children. Before and after photographs, medical records, behavioral assessments, progress notes written in clinical language that attempted to sanitize the horror of what was actually occurring. One file was labeled simply, Subject 7, Lily Chen, Initial Assessment. The dates indicated that Lily had been in their custody for nearly 4 years. 4 years of captivity, 4 years of abuse, 4 years of suffering. 4 years. Miller breathed, unable to comprehend how such an operation could have gone undetected for so long. How had no one noticed? How had no one asked questions? How had the system failed so catastrophically? He carefully opened Lily's file, his hands trembling slightly with barely suppressed rage. The first document was a medical assessment, clinical and detached, describing her physical condition in terms that reduced her to a collection of measurements and observations. Height, weight, physical development, all recorded as if she were a laboratory specimen rather than a human child. Subsequent pages documented her progress in the program, tracking her behavioral responses, her compliance levels, her psychological state. One entry, dated approximately 6 months after her initial intake, read, Subject 7 demonstrates exceptional adaptability. Initial resistance has been overcome through consistent application of conditioning protocols. Subject now exhibits appropriate compliance and obedience. Recommend advancement to Level 2 responsibilities. The detachment in the writing was almost more disturbing than the content itself. These weren't the observations of humans studying other humans. They were the notes of predators studying prey, cataloging their progress in breaking down resistance and creating compliance. Harris? Miller called, his voice tight. You need to see this. Harris approached, and Miller handed her the file, watching her face as she read through the documents. Her expression shifted from professional detachment to barely concealed horror and rage. They have a system, Harris said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. Levels of progression, behavioral metrics, compliance scores. This is a program. A systematic program designed to break children down and rebuild them according to their specifications. Which means there are others, Miller realized, the full implications crystallizing in his mind. Other facilities, other operators, all following the same protocol. This isn't isolated. This is franchised. Miller? Another technician called from across the room, her voice urgent. You need to see this. Miller made his way over to where she stood, examining the computer equipment. She had managed to power on one of the monitors, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a series of files and folders. The directory structure was organized by date and location, and Miller's eyes widened as he read the folder names. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, Denver, Seattle, Boston, Atlanta, San Francisco, Phoenix, and dozens more. It's not just this city, Harris said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. This network extends across the entire country, maybe further, maybe international. The implications were staggering and deeply disturbing. What they had initially thought was a localized criminal operation was actually part of a vast, interconnected network. The Harmony Foundation wasn't just a front. It was the central hub of a massive human trafficking enterprise, a nexus point for an operation that spanned the entire continent. Miller felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he contemplated the scope of what they had uncovered. They weren't just investigating a crime. They were uncovering a criminal empire, a sophisticated, well-organized network that had been operating in the shadows for years, preying on the most vulnerable members of society. "We need to call the FBI," Miller said, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. "This is beyond our jurisdiction. We need federal resources, and we need them now. This is bigger than any local police department can handle." As he made the call, Miller's mind raced through the possibilities and the dangers. Someone had sent him a threatening message, and now he understood why. They had stumbled onto something far larger and more dangerous than they had anticipated. The people running this operation had resources, connections, and clearly no compunction about using violence to protect their interests. They had built an empire on the suffering of children, and they would fight viciously to defend it. "The FBI is sending a team," Miller informed his officers after completing the call, his voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions churning inside him. "They'll be here within the hour. In the meantime, I want every file, every photograph, every piece of data carefully cataloged and secured. Nothing leaves this basement without proper documentation and chain of custody. Is that understood?" The team responded with a unified affirmation, understanding the critical nature of their work. They were no longer just investigators. They were the guardians of evidence that could bring down an entire criminal empire. The responsibility weighed on them, but it also galvanized them, focusing their efforts with laser-like intensity. As Miller stood in the center of the sub-basement, surrounded by the physical manifestation of unspeakable crimes, he felt a profound sense of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy mantle. The children they had rescued were just the tip of the iceberg. Somewhere out there, other children were suffering, trapped in similar situations, waiting for someone to find them and bring them to safety. Somewhere, parents were grieving, not knowing if their children were alive or dead. Somewhere, there were empty rooms and unanswered questions. He thought of Lily, of Jake, of Abby, and of little Mia, all of them victims of a calculated, systematic exploitation. But they were also survivors, and their survival had led to the discovery of this operation. Their courage in enduring the unendurable had given them a voice, even if they didn't yet realize the power of that voice. Their testimony, combined with the evidence they were now gathering, could change everything. Detective Miller, one of the forensic technicians, approached him, holding a sealed evidence bag. "You should see this. We found it in a locked drawer in the main desk." Inside the bag was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwritten entries in meticulous script. The technician carefully opened it to a random page, and Miller read the entries, detailed accounts of the children's progress, written in Sarah Thompson's precise handwriting. The entries were clinical, detached, devoid of any humanity or compassion. They read like laboratory notes on experimental subjects rather than observations of human children. One entry, dated approximately 6 months prior, read, "Subject 7, Lily, continues to show exceptional compliance and adaptability. Her conditioning is nearly complete. Recommend promotion to Level 2 responsibilities. She demonstrates sufficient obedience to assist with integration of new subjects. Estimated market value, $250,000 for specialized placement. Subject 4, Jake. Shows promise but requires additional behavioral modification. Resistance remains problematic. Subject 9, Abby, has bonded with Subject 4. Consider separating them to reduce emotional dependency and increase compliance. Miller felt rage surge through him, threatening to overwhelm his professional composure. Market value. They had reduced these children to commodities, assigning them prices based on their perceived utility to their criminal enterprise. The thought of these children being discussed in terms of market value, of being evaluated for potential placement as if they were merchandise to be sold, was almost too much to bear. Another entry, dated more recently, contained a chilling reference. New acquisition from Chicago facility. Subject 15, Marcus, age 6, shows significant trauma response. Recommend intensive conditioning protocol. Initial projections suggest 6 to 8 week timeline to baseline compliance. Coordination with New York facility regarding potential placement in specialized program. Preliminary interest from overseas clients. Estimated value, 400,000 plum. Overseas clients. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. This wasn't just domestic trafficking, it was international. These children weren't just being exploited, they were being sold to the highest bidder, potentially being transported across international borders to unknown fates. Get this to the FBI as soon as they arrive, Miller instructed, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. And I want everything, and I mean everything, from this basement secured and inventoried. These files are going to help us dismantle this entire network. Every name, every location, every transaction, all of it is evidence. As the evening wore on and the FBI team began to arrive, Miller found himself standing once again in the Thompson living room, looking at the family photographs on the wall. In one image, the Thompsons smiled at the camera, their arms around each other, the picture of domestic bliss and suburban contentment. In another, they stood in front of the house during what appeared to be a neighborhood block party, surrounded by smiling neighbors, the perfect picture of community involvement. In yet another, they were pictured at what appeared to be a charity gala, dressed in formal attire, their faces radiating warmth and generosity. The photographs were lies, carefully constructed narratives designed to conceal the monsters that lurked beneath. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a seasoned FBI investigator with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, approached Miller. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her demeanor suggested someone who had seen the worst of humanity and refused to be broken by it. Detective, I've reviewed the preliminary findings from the basement, Torres said, her voice steady and professional. This is significant. We're looking at a multi-state, possibly multinational trafficking operation. The Harmony Foundation appears to be just one node in a much larger network. We're already coordinating with our field offices across the country and with Interpol. This is going to be massive. How many children? Miller asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Based on the documentation we've found so far, we're looking at least 30 to 40 confirmed victims across the country over the past 5 years. Torres replied, her voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. But that number could be much higher. We're still going through the files. Some of these entries reference transfers between facilities, which suggests ongoing operations we haven't yet located. We could be looking at hundreds of victims across multiple countries. 30 to 40 children confirmed, with potentially hundreds more unaccounted for. The number was almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. Miller thought of the children in the basement, and he multiplied that suffering by 30 or 40, and then by potentially 100 or more. and the result was almost too much to bear. The scope of the evil they were uncovering seemed almost impossible to fully comprehend. "What do you need from us?" Miller asked, focusing on what he could control, what he could do to help bring these criminals to justice. "Everything," Torres replied with determination. "Your investigation, your evidence, your interviews with the children, all of it. We're going to need to coordinate with local law enforcement across multiple states. This is going to be a massive undertaking, but I can promise you one thing. We will find everyone involved in this operation, and we will make sure they answer for what they've done. This ends now." As Miller walked Torres through the evidence they had collected, pointing out the filing systems, the computer records, the journal entries, and the video equipment, he felt a cautious sense of hope beginning to emerge from the darkness. The discovery of the Harmony Foundation's network, while terrifying in its scope, also meant that they now had a roadmap to dismantle it. The children they had rescued could provide testimony. The documents they had found could provide evidence. And the determination of law enforcement, both local and federal, could provide justice. Torres listened intently, asking pointed questions, making notes, her sharp mind already beginning to formulate a strategy for the investigation. "We'll need to secure all of this equipment," she said, gesturing to the computer setup. "Our forensic computer specialists can extract data from these systems. There could be communications, financial records, client lists. All of it could be stored digitally. We'll also need to coordinate with the local authorities to identify and locate the other facilities referenced in these files." "What about the children?" Miller asked. "The ones we rescued, will they be safe?" "They'll be placed in protective custody with trained social workers and child psychologists," Torres assured him. "We have specialized facilities for trafficking victims. They'll receive counseling, medical care, and support as they begin the process of healing. And their testimony will be crucial. Children can be powerful witnesses, and juries respond to their accounts in ways that can be very effective in court." As the night wore on, Miller found himself coordinating with both his local team and the FBI agents, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly documented and preserved. The basement became a hive of activity. Technicians photographing and cataloging items, detectives interviewing officers about the initial discovery, forensic specialists carefully extracting data from computers and devices. It was nearly midnight when Miller finally stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the light pollution from the suburban neighborhood. He stood in the driveway of the Thompson house, looking at the structure that had concealed such darkness, and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His phone buzzed with a message. Another unknown number. Miller's hand trembled slightly as he opened it. The message was brief, but chilling. "You've made a grave mistake, Detective. There are people much more powerful than you who have invested interests in this operation. Consider yourself and your family warned. Back off now or face consequences you cannot imagine." Miller stared at the message, his jaw tightening. The threat was explicit, the danger real. But backing off was not an option. Not now. Not when they were so close to bringing these monsters to justice. He showed the message to Torres, who read it with a grim expression. "This confirms what we suspected," she said. "There are powerful people involved in this operation. We'll need to increase security around you and your family. We can also trace this message. Our tech specialists can work on locating the source." "I'm not backing off," Miller said firmly. "Whatever it takes. We're seeing this through." "I know," Torres replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And we'll make sure you're protected." You're not alone in this anymore, Detective. The full resources of the FBI are now behind this investigation. As Miller drove home in the early hours of the morning, the threat lingering in his mind, he thought about the children they had rescued and the countless others still trapped in the darkness. He thought about the evidence they had gathered and the network they were beginning to dismantle. And he thought about the road ahead, a road that would be dangerous, challenging, and uncertain, but also one that led toward justice. The investigation had entered a new phase, one that would require coordination across state lines, international cooperation, and unwavering determination. But Miller was ready. He had made a promise to those children, and he intended to keep it, no matter what obstacles lay ahead.